for here today. I am delighted to be here with you this morning. I have a whole list of things that I would like to talk about this morning. I would like to talk about how you choose to do your jobs. I would like to talk about how you choose to live your lives. I'd like to talk about things professionally and personally. I'd like to talk about how you meet the problems that you're faced with, how you get through the days that are tough. I'd like to say, like the days when some of you were trying to fly for 22 hours yesterday to get here. I'd like to talk about how you're going to deal with the tragedy that's coming in your life. And we're all going to have tragedy in our lives. Some of us have, but we're all going to have it. I'd like to talk about how you exercise the influence that you have and the position of influence that you have in the company. People are watching you, you know. They're watching you very closely. Some of them probably don't think you deserve to be here. But they're watching you. And what kind of example are you going to set? And how are you going to do that? And how you... Actually, the list of things that I want to talk about today gets to be very, very long when I start to think about it. And I'd like to talk about that whole list and a few more by means of an analogy. An analogy is... Come on, this is a test this morning. An analogy is a comparison, a story. I want to tell you a story this morning. The inference is we can make some sort of connection between the story I want to tell you and that whole list of things that I started on. Now, I know from experience I can make a few of those connections. Believe me, whenever I can make one, I'm going to make one. More interesting, at least to me, I've discovered that you can make lots more connections than I can make. So, I would like for you to hang in there for just a little while this morning with this question burning uppermost in your mind. So what? So what do I care about what that guy says? Why would I even listen to that? So what? I'd like for you to do some real-time integration. Now, the analogy goes like this. I imagine, just from looking at you, that everybody in this room has had at least one thing happen to you in your life so far, and maybe more than one for a few of us, but at least one thing happened to you in your life that had so much impact on you, that was so huge in your life, that was so significant, that if I ask you to think about it this morning, it would be as though it just happened. I mean, on rare occasions, something will happen in our lives that's so emotionally charged, so hugely significant, has so much impact, that it's kind of indelibly burned into our brains, and it's always right there. For me, one of those things happened the 31st of August, 1967. I do not want to know how old some of you were in 1967. Worse yet, I do not want to know that some of you might not even have been in 1967. I don't want to know. See, the 31st of August, 1967 stands out in my mind as though it's etched in crystal. I can look at every detail of it. I can run it forward, backward, fast motion, stop action. The 31st of August, 1967, I was a somewhat younger naval aviator. I was flying an A-4 aircraft off the aircraft carrier Riscony. We were stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin, about 60 miles from the coast of North Vietnam. The 31st of August, 1967, in the Gulf of Tonkin. It was one of those hazy gray days at sea. Kind of day where when you stand up on the flight deck and look out there, there's no horizon. Everything just kind of the same color. It goes from over your head to under your feet. We manned airplanes about 7 o'clock in the morning, launched 18 of them from the ship, rendezvoused overhead, got ourselves organized, pointed the noses toward the coast of North Vietnam. The target that day was a small railroad bridge just inland from the port city of Haiphong. We crossed the beach. They started shooting. They always started shooting. That day, among all the other things, I remember very clearly, they fired in succession from way out in front of us 2 surface-to-air missiles. Now, back in those days, a surface-to-air missile was about the size of a small telephone pole. There'd be so much dust and flame kicked up from when they'd launch them, just get them off the rails, that from altitude we could see them launch them from miles away. And once they had them in the sky, the plume of flame on the booster rocket was so big and so bright, you could just track them as they went through the sky. So I sat in my cockpit that day and I watched the first missile. A little itty-bitty point of light sitting on the windshield. And it just sat there. And it got bigger and brighter and bigger and brighter, till finally it started to move. And as soon as it started to move on the windshield, I knew it wouldn't hit me. That's right. Right? It's a relative motion kind of problem. It's like when you try to get on the freeway. As long as there's some relative movement between those cars, they don't hit each other, theoretically. So as soon as this missile started to move, I knew it wouldn't hit me. I turned my attention to the second missile, and it just sat there, this little point of light. And it's getting bigger and brighter and bigger and brighter. So finally I decided if it wouldn't move, I would. And that day I had a brilliant idea. You've probably had ideas like this. They kind of come to us in a flash, all of a sudden we know. What I decided to do, rather than go to my left and have to dodge through 16 airplanes that were out here somewhere beside me, I decided to just roll my airplane up on its back, go across the top of the only airplane on my right, come down on the outside, and press onto the target. And it was a good idea, too, until I was upside down over this airplane beside me. The missile went right between us. There was a huge explosion. Fireball blew the tail section off my airplane. Airplane just stayed on its back. I didn't know the tail was gone, by the way. It just stayed on its back, started spinning and tumbling and gyrating and falling through the sky. It was shaking so bad that nothing would focus. When I tried to look at the instrument panel and see what was going on, it was just a blur in the cockpit. The stick was real loose, like not connected to anything anymore. Both rudder pedals were up against the firewall. This thing was wallowing and falling and tumbling through the sky. I had all the flying characteristics of your cell phone. This thing, I tell you, this thing was coming through the sky like a ton of lead. And I'll tell you something else. Every time the nose of that airplane would go by the water, it seemed like it would hesitate. And for me, that water meant safety. And I'd think, this thing is going to fly. And I'd start stirring on the stick and kicking the pedals. The nose would whip off. Going through 4,000 feet, I got a glimpse of my altimeter, ejected from the airplane, had a parachute, landed in the middle of a small North Vietnamese village. Now, when I first landed, there was nobody around. They went for air raids. I got rid of my helmet and my parachute. I ducked out between the hooches, and I started running out across the rice paddy. And as I'm running out across the rice paddy, and running is probably not the operative word. The mud in the rice paddy is about this deep, and I'm slugging my way out through there as best I can. And as I'm going through the rice paddy, I can look up, and I can see the airplanes flying away. So I'm kind of half watching the airplanes, and I'm trying to get through. I get to about the middle of the rice paddy, and I can see that one of those airplanes is turning around, and he's going to come back. So I stopped right there. I started digging around in my gear, and I dug out a little radio. Now, this little radio that we carried, it was, in fact, about the size of some of your cell phones. It was just a little itty-bitty thing, and I had had this radio in my hands a lot of times. The Navy used to make us get them out and check the batteries. We used to play with them on the ship. The point is, I've had this radio in my hands a lot. But now I'm standing out in the middle of this rice paddy. I have mud up to the middle of my calves. I got this little radio in my hands. For the life of me, I couldn't get that radio turned on. It was like I had all thumbs on both my hands. I'm watching him, and he's getting closer, and I got this little radio. And this is not a complicated machine either. It only has two little switches on it. But I can't get the switches in the right place. And he's getting closer, and I'm watching him. Until finally, about the time he boomed across the top, I managed to mash down the right combination of buttons on that little radio, and it sparked to life, which allowed me to say, in my very finest airline pilot drawl, help right away, give me some help. And I started babbling on this radio, and my voice was up about 3 octaves, and it was just all gushing out of me. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, this does not sound good. But there was nothing I could do about it. I babbled on that radio. I went on and on. And by the way, I had been trained that it would have been better for me to die than to not sound good on the radios. This is serious stuff that's happening here. But there was nothing I could do. I babbled and babbled on that radio. I went on and on. The best thing that happened was I ran myself out of breath. And when I ran out of breath, I had to pause the inhale. And when I paused the inhale, I let off one of those buttons on that little radio, which allowed Dean to get a word in edgewise. And he said, we cannot come and get you. At which point I couldn't think of anything clever to say. And Dean said, I'll see you when this is over. And he flew away. And I stood out there in the middle of that rice paddy. I don't know how to describe it to you. It was like I was the only person in the entire intergalactic universe. I was out there by myself. There was no one. I was all alone. And probably I don't have to describe that to you too much. Because I'd be willing to bet money just from looking at you. That you've already had times in your life when you get that alone feeling. I mean, stuff happens. Sometimes you have to make decisions. Sometimes you got to stand up and be counted. Sometimes you get the feeling like there's nobody. It's just you, all alone, all by yourself. Well, I wasn't alone for very long, of course. The next thing that happened was I was almost immediately surrounded by about 1 million North Vietnamese. Well, I'm just getting warmed up now.